Hello, everyone. You are listening to She Leads with Carly, and in this show, we talk to the absolute best, brightest, and yes, badass leaders. I'm your host, Carly Malatsky. Hello, everyone. I am super excited to welcome our guest today, Pollys Rodriguez. Pollys is the CEO and co-founder of Unbound, a rebellious sexual wellness company with the goal to make sexual health accessible to all through elevated design, body-safe products, affordable prices, and educational content. As you will soon discover, Unbound's inspiration stemmed largely from Pollys' experience at 21 years old. She was diagnosed with cancer that resulted in early-onset menopause. Pollys found herself shopping for a vibrator at a seedy shop next to the highway in St. Louis, Missouri, and this entire experience ultimately led to her founding Unbound with her co-founder Sarah 10 years later. Before Unbound, Pollys earned her bachelors from Miami University in business economics and went on to work as a consultant at Deloitte before joining an early-stage YC-backed startup in the dating app space called Grouper. Perhaps more than anything, she learned what it meant to work at a failed startup with that experience. After Grouper, though, Pollys decided to take the final leap in founding Unbound, largely through her own personal experience with sexual health and wellness. Pollys, it is so great to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Of course. Okay, so first, Pollys, set the scene for us. Where are you in the world? What's going on?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm wearing a gigantic headset, a gamer headset, from my very small apartment in the West Village, in New York, New York. The city's so nice. They named it twice. And yeah, I'm excited to be here. There is a huge snowstorm headed for New York. So what better way to spend my time than inside talking to you?
Amazing. I love it. Okay, Pollys, what I love to do is I want to get to know 5-year-old Pollys in a way. Who was she? What was your childhood like?
Oh, 5-year-old me was definitely very theatrical. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, in the Shaw neighborhood, which is in downtown St. Louis, and I have a sister that is close to me in age. She's like a year and a half younger, and we just put on lots of theatrical productions. We're very like extroverted, and very like curious and creative. My mom's a social worker. She works for the Alzheimer's Association for like 35 years. And my dad worked managing apartment complexes, mostly subsidized income housing. And so, yeah, just like a very like lower middle class background, living in the inner city, and just very bohemian kind of parents, I guess. I don't know if that answers the question, though.
Yeah, no, totally. And given where you are today, you founded your own company. Were there pieces of your childhood that you can now look back on and be like, I had that entrepreneurial spirit back then?
You know, it's so funny because I don't, if you were to ask me that, like, I feel like my initial reaction would be like, no, absolutely not. But when I take a minute to pause and think about it, I think what was really influential was I had two grandmothers who actually started their own businesses. And I never really thought of myself as coming from an entrepreneurial family, but
Right.
looking back on it, it was so rare for, women of their generation. They're both born in the early or late 1920s, mid 1920s. Anyways, and one was an antique dealer who had her own antique shop, and the other was a landscape architect, and she had her own business. And so I think whether or not I realized it as a kid, having two women in my life as role models that were building their own businesses was certainly influential, even if I wasn't like cognizant of it.
Yeah. So I mentioned in the intro, obviously, of your experience at 21 years old. Take me through even a little bit before then. You went to Miami University. What were you passionate about? Was that passion for business already pretty clear and you were like, I want to study business? Or how were you thinking through career and that aspect of your life?
I would love to say I was like a really put together individual, but I got to college and really had no idea what I wanted to do, and didn't declare my major until technically junior year. I felt very lost in terms of like, what do I want to pursue and what do I want to go into? And I'm someone who I think will pursue something just I would like to say not out of spite, but like because it's difficult or because people tell me I can't do it. And so freshman year, I had an econ professor who said that I could never cut it as an econ major. And I really thought that was, it made me like kind of angry. And I also really liked economics. And so I ended up ultimately picking economics, but I did not know at all what I wanted to do when I got to school. And definitely like floundered for a while trying to figure out kind of, do I want to go like political science route? Do I want to go the marketing route? Do I want to go the quant route? And it was also like right before I was a freshman in college in 2005. So it was like right before the economy just completely collapsed. And so being in college while that happened was also like, I think I made a lot of decisions based on like what will position me strongest to actually get a job when I graduate, because so many people weren't able to get jobs in the like 2008, 2009 economy.
And even growing up, probably with your parents' professions and your background, you were almost looking for that secure path, if you will.
Oh, for sure. I
Would you
mean,
agree? Yeah.
yeah, I went to school knowing that there wasn't an economic safety net and that I had to get a job as soon as I graduated because, like, mom and dad weren't going to be able to support me. And so I
Right.
treated college kind of like I treat work, which is, you know, and college is so expensive. And I remember just being like acutely aware, even as a kid, as a young adult, of how much things cost and how expensive college was. Even with, I got scholarships, but even with financial aid and scholarships, it was just still so expensive. And so I was determined to kind of graduate with like a job and a plan, despite the fact that my college experience was definitely not typical in the sense that I got sick and I had to drop out and all of that. So I was motivated in, I guess, like a lot of different ways, but financially was probably the primary motivation.
Yeah. So let's talk about that experience that you had a junior year, I believe, where you were diagnosed with cancer. So walk me through that, the mental toll, just everything about that experience, and then we'll obviously dive into it as well.
Yeah. I mean, it was weird because when I first got to college, I started having symptoms. I had like blood in my stool or like blood when I would go to the bathroom. And I remember asking a doctor when my first fall break, I went home and I was like, these are symptoms that I'm seeing. And like, it was very much dismissed. And it was kind of like, oh, you're probably just nervous when you go to the bathroom. And I'm thinking like, I'm not that nervous.
Right.
And so I was studying abroad in Spain and I was going to Universidad Complutense in Madrid. And I just was so ill. I was so sick all the time. I couldn't eat anything. I was lightheaded. I was losing a lot of blood. But this sounds so silly now as like a grown adult, but as a 21 year old living in a foreign country, I was just like so scared because I knew something was deeply wrong, but I knew if I went to the hospital, it was going to like blow up my life. And it is hard to live in a different country and to be enrolled in a fully immersed university where I was taking like 300 level classes in Spanish, but like still so sick. And I look back on that and I certainly wish I would have gone to see a doctor in Madrid, but I put it off. But the first week I got home in December from that semester of studying abroad, I immediately went to see a doctor and was like, something's really, really wrong. And so I got a colonoscopy and I'll never forget like waking up and the gastroenterologist is standing over me and this grown man is like crying, saying like it is cancer and it's really, really bad. And I just like your life just all of a sudden accelerates at like 60 miles an hour. We're like,
Totally.
a week ago, I was picking out like what classes do I want to go to next semester and like what do I want to focus on? What do I want to specialize in? And within a week, all of a sudden your life is just getting CT scans and PET scans and testing and starting radiation and chemotherapy and surgeries and all this stuff. And when you're 21 years old, you want to like not be doing obviously any of that. But it was definitely an experience that I think changed me in a myriad of ways. It changed my understanding of relationships with my family, what I like understood to be like unconditional love. And
Totally.
it also like physically changed my body for the rest of my life, because as part of my treatment plan, I had to go through radiation to shrink the size of the tumor. And before this whole process started, which obviously was quite accelerated because the tumor at that point had grown quite a bit, I had been misdiagnosed for 4 or 5 years, with like everything from IBS to being lactose intolerant. So by the time they actually did a colonoscopy, which is really rare to do on someone that's 20 or 21 years old, they were
Yeah.
like, oh, this is a very large tumor. This has progressed. You're stage 3C, which is the last possible segment you can be in before you're terminal. And so I immediately had to jump into radiation and oral chemotherapy. And the doctor sat me down and said, we're going to have to beam the radiation through your reproductive organs. And as a result, you'll never have children. But that was all they really told me, was that I would be infertile. And they didn't ever mention like that I was going to go through menopause, that, going through menopause at such a young age would have lifelong symptoms and
Right.
life altering things that would just happen to my body. And so it wasn't until I was like Googling some of these symptoms that I realized, oh, I'm going through menopause at 21. Like what does that mean? I don't even know really what menopause is.
Yeah.
And that led me down this whole rabbit hole online and in person, of like going to a
Oof.
sex toy store and just feeling really embarrassed, one, by like the lack of knowledge I had about the subject
Yeah.
matter, but also just the whole shopping experience was just garbage. It just, made me feel really embarrassed and ashamed to be there. And I think given the embarrassment and shame I already felt about having colon cancer and being so young and going through all this, it just felt like insult to injury to have to also be in a store that made me feel like I was doing something that was like morally wrong, or like it was
Right.
one of those things where I was like, why does this have to feel so shitty on top of already feeling so shitty about everything else going on in my life? So that definitely stuck with me for sure.
Wow. So, Polly, first of all, thank you so much for just sharing and being so vulnerable in this time in your life, because I think one thing that just speaks to me so strongly is you're in Spain, studying abroad. Yes, you're having these crazy symptoms, but still, just the idea of cancer seems so far removed,
Hmm.
right? And like that shock factor of hearing it from a doctor, and again, not having anyone in your close community per se to lean on from a physician standpoint, to give you that insight. And it's really just the doctor and Google, and those are your two sources. And it's scary because even, people laugh about it today when, like, you have a cough and you look it up on Google and suddenly you think you're dying because of a cough. Like there's that scary factor of finding out information through these different sources. And then, and remind me, the doctor, what was the prognosis? From reading online, it was like 20 to 30% chance.
Yeah, so the way they diagnose it is they give you stages, and then when they can't really know for sure how bad it is until they go in and actually remove the tumor. But when they went
Yeah.
in to remove my tumor, they were able to see like, oh, this has spread to your lymph nodes, which are kind of like the highways of your body in terms of how, disease can spread. And so they had given me like a 25% chance of survival. And then in addition to that, they said, because this has spread already based on our ability to test the lymph nodes, there's an 80% chance that it's going to come back. Even if we remove
Wow.
the main tumor, it's clearly already growing in a microscopic way that we can't visually see yet throughout your body. And so, yeah, that had a huge impact on like just my mentality and my understanding of mentality, of being given really horrible statistics and information, and then just kind of trying to figure out like, how do you sit with that information, how do you live with that information, and like, how do you mentally think about or choose not to think about what that means for just like your day-to-day life, because it feels like this
Yeah.
just heavy huge cloud hanging over you.
And how did you, thinking back to your experience, right? Obviously, there's such a huge physical toll on your body with chemo, radiation, all of that. What were almost the intangibles that really got you through it,
Hmm.
that you look back on now, whether it's, mentally, your family, community, whatever it may be? What do you attribute, coming out of that?
I'm really lucky because my dad, I mean, I don't know that that's luck, but my dad had gotten diagnosed with cancer is very prevalent in my family. So
Wow.
I
Okay.
had a lot of people in my life that I was close with who had also been given these horrific odds and had somehow managed to overcome them. And so I was really lucky that I came from a family, both immediate and extended, that had experience with cancer and knew what it takes and what it entails to try to like mentally get through it. And I'll never forget, like, when I first got diagnosed, I had Googled my stage and my cancer type and all the like medical information the doctors just kind of hurl at you. And and you're just kind of sitting there in shock in the moment. And so, you write stuff down and then you go home and you Google it and you end up on a message board with a bunch of people saying like, oh, I'm going to die. Like it just,
Right.
long story short, my dad walked in on me reading these message boards of people who had the same diagnosis and stage that I did.
Yeah.
And I'm just like sitting in front of this, like, Dell desktop computer in 2008, sobbing hysterically. And he just looks at me and he's like, if I ever catch you reading one of these message boards again, I will throw this computer in the trash can.
Right.
And I didn't get it at first, but when I asked him, I was like, well, why are you so angry about this? He said, when I was diagnosed with bone cancer, my dad had cancer of the jaw where they had to physically take out the entire bone and put in a metal jaw, and gave him a less than 5% survival rate. And that was when he was 28 years old, way, way, way back in like the 70s.
Yeah.
But he's healthy now and survived it. And he was just like, you can sit there and you can read the numbers. And I think that this is actually very also applicable to entrepreneurship, which is like the stats are what they are. And you can either let that dictate your mentality around it, or you can just decide that you're not going to like pay attention to all the noise of why it won't work, why you're, positioned to fail. Because ultimately it's
Yeah.
not really about you relative to what everyone else has done. It's you relative to yourself and like what you feel prepared and capable of doing. Which was a concept that like I don't know I would have been able to really understand and embrace had it not been like literally a life and death situation.
Wow. And obviously, part of that story, as you mentioned, is that you went through menopause at a super early age. And that's something that the doctor didn't even warn you about, per se. And this ultimately led to Unbound in a sense, right? So, walk me a bit through that journey of the frustrations of the medical system and you even working for, the senator on the Affordable Health Care Act. Walk through that journey and like how reality kind of strayed a little bit from the expectation.
Yeah, it's hard because like I love my doctors and they like saved my life. But as I got
Totally.
older, I realized like had I been a man, I think it probably would have been addressed. Well, it would have been addressed at all, and it would have been addressed more directly and from a perspective of overall well being. Menopause was never uttered as like a thing I would go through, and so it wasn't until I got older and I'd already had careers, working for Senator Claire McCaskill and in management consulting and then at a dating startup. And it wasn't until then that I really realized how underserved I was. Because I think it's very hard to kind of stand up and say, like, I deserved better. I deserved a little more than what I was
Yeah.
given when you're coming from a perspective of like, it was either this or death.
Life
And so
threatening.
it's
Totally.
so it's tough to kind of say like I should have been given more information, more support, more just access to like quality of life information. And I think more broadly, like that is applicable to a lot of women, femme, and non-binary individuals who go through the medical system. And I think our sexuality is more often than not, viewed through the lens of fertility, motherhood,
Yep.
pregnancy. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, not necessarily in the medical system, but just in general, is like the hypersexualization of like women. And I think like it's the Madonna whore complex that goes all the way back to Freud. And it's still true today that we don't really service, care for, educate women, feminine, non-binary individuals in terms of just like your sexuality is part of your health and quality of life. and we should talk about it and teach and educate based on that belief. But instead, it's really only through the lens of like, can you get pregnant and can you have children? Which is important, but it's certainly not the only reason people have sex, enjoy their bodies. And I think I felt really genuinely angry about the fact that like my sex life and my quality of sex life wasn't even really considered as something to address or talk about in a medical setting when I was 21 years old. Like if I was a man going through something comparable, like it would have been immediately addressed. And in fact, for men, there are specific procedures where when they go through radiation, they will go above and beyond to actually move
Wow.
reproductive organs to preserve their ability to have children. Whereas for women, they just don't do that. And so there's tons of data studies and statistics I can share about how underserved women are in the medical community world as patients when it comes to their sexuality. But it was just something I felt like I could act on and improve in a way that felt like meaningful and tangible.
And it's so interesting, and I'd love your thoughts on this because you mentioned the difference in the medical community, but even outside of that, from societal norms, I think it is so significantly talked about to a lesser degree than masturbating for men versus women. And so I'm wondering, how did those two aspects come into play when you ultimately decided, you know what, I need to start Unbound?
Yeah. I mean, even something as anecdotal as like, gosh, I will try to be concise with this because I have so many thoughts about it. But
Yeah.
essentially, what is frustrating is that, and I'm going to use like broad stroke terms here in the effort to be concise, but for men, pleasure and procreation are one and the same. In order to have a family, in order to have children, you have to have an erection, you have to orgasm. That's how, you fertilize the egg, so on and so forth. For women, both today and historically, those two things are really decoupled, where it's like
Hmm.
childbirth and procreation is one thing in and of itself, which is just considered like fertility, menstruation, ovulation. But pleasure, orgasm, arousal, all of these things they're decoupled because you don't necessarily need to experience that in order to have a kid. And so what has happened is systemically, the way we approach sexuality is that for men, pleasure and procreation and family planning are the same umbrella, same bucket. And so advertising, access to information, products, services, everything that exists, those two are under the guise of being the same thing. Whereas for women, we have very recently started to be more comfortable and allow menstruation, fertility, procreation products and services that advertise, and we are okay with allowing access to that. But when it comes to pleasure, whether that's menopause, lubricant, vibrators, anything that would improve the experience of procreating or just having sex, which is the vast majority of, most people are having sex for pleasure, not necessarily to start a family. And so it's been really frustrating and infuriating at times to try to exist in a world in which you're trying to merge those two things so that women still have the same access information and tools to enjoy sex, to experience pleasure that men do. And I think like one of the most poignant examples of this is, we've had presidential candidates like Bob Dole was a spokesperson for Viagra. You think about the famous people that have represented a lot of the off-brand Viagra. I mean, you have everyone from like A-Rod to like just the
Yeah.
proliferation of drugs and services that support men in their pursuit of pleasure and orgasm, which is a good thing. But conversely, for women, I mean, have you ever seen an ad for women's, like, it doesn't exist. And I think it's really hard when you exist in the ecosystem and see the censorship that exists and how hard it is to advertise, open a bank account, post on social media, because all of these systems, for whatever reason, feel incredibly threatened by women, femme, non-binary individuals having autonomy and authority over their pleasure and their bodies. And so it can be very difficult not to be cynical when you exist in that ecosystem and see just like the stark inequality that exists.
Totally. Okay, we've kind of gone off of a tangent. No, this is great and it's so interesting. And I'm curious, you deciding to found Unbound, obviously like at the core in this space. Was there ever a point where you were like, the narrative outside, the forces going on outside of my efforts in Unbound are so far from where I want to go that it almost hindered you and it almost dissuaded you from pursuing it?
I mean, there's so many times where I wanted to give up if
Yeah,
that's the question. I
totally.
mean, because I think I really thought, and I continue to think, or at least believe, that when you're able to like tell it that directly of like, we allow one, but we do not allow the other.
Right.
Explain this to me because I cannot understand the difference outside of like who it serves, man versus woman. And it's tough because I've been doing this now for almost 10 years, and it's hard not to become truly like cynical, and kind of heartbroken because still to this day we can't advertise the majority of our products on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or Twitter or the subway or TV.
Right.
And you see other companies like Hims and Roman and Blue Chew and Viagra that are worth billions. And it's really, yeah, it's really hard not to feel like why, to feel genuinely confused by why we believe there's so much value in one gender's sexual pleasure,
Yeah.
wellness, etc. But then in the other gender, like we don't see market opportunity, we don't see validity. And so, yeah, there are a lot of times where I oscillate between like rage that empowers me to want to change the system and rage that like exhausts me to the point where I've been trying to get it to be changed for 10 years. And I'm not alone. I mean, you look at like Cindy Gallup, who's the founder of Make Love Not Porn, who has one of the best TED Talks about this of all time.
Yeah.
And just individuals that have been trying to break this huge stigma and inequality for decades, and none of us have really been able to do it yet. And it's hard to know like what will it take to actually
Yeah.
change it.
And Polly, you mentioned something that I believe many founders go through, regardless of their industry, regardless of what's going on externally. And I'd love to know, in those moments, right, where you feel like, you know what, I'm exhausted and is this worth it? And can I do this? How do you get through that? What does that look like for you?
I'm not great at it. I'm going to be honest. Like, I'm trying so hard to get better at it, but I'm like a dog with a bone where I'll sit there and just like spin myself into, a circle until I puke because it's hard for me to kind of step back and be like, okay, like you're not like digging into this further is not going to get you further. But I do think the thing that's been the most helpful ultimately is community. It's building because you feel crazy, whether it's this industry or any, when you're starting a business, you're like, this like 80% of the time it doesn't work. Whatever you're doing, it doesn't work. And you're
Right.
living for the 20% of the time it does work. But it's so helpful to be surrounded by other founders who are going through the same thing, because it's just such a different day-to-day lifestyle of failing constantly, but being driven by the people that are around you that are doing the same thing and failing in the same way, but then also having people around you who want to celebrate when it works and when things do, when you have those like wins. Just having other
Yeah.
founders is in your world and in your sphere is like so important.
And I think, and I heard you actually mention this in another podcast, but what's really interesting is that so often you see the PR, online presence, and quote unquote success that other founders are experiencing. Walk me a little bit through that maybe dissonance from, your community and your founders that you're personally talking to versus what you see online and how you almost ensure that you protect yourself from
Mm.
getting down on that.
I mean, in being in the startup world now for almost 15 years, I think the thing that I know to be true more than anything else, especially in consumer facing businesses, which is what I've been in, is that nothing is ever as it seems on the surface. Like nothing is ever as it seems. And people can be getting like the best PR placement and huge articles and big features and massive rounds of funding. And I guarantee you, there is some aspect of the business that is a total shit show, that is like a disaster and that is not going well, because either you're growing like crazy and moving quickly, and things are breaking left and right, which is like incredibly stressful and can
Right.
more often than not be the demise of the business. Or conversely, you're not having that fast growth. And so you're having to constantly spin your wheels and try to figure out like, how do I actually like grow this? What does it take? What do I do? How do I try everything possible without like completely exhausting myself to figure out what works? And so I guess the press thing is just one example of many examples in which I think we put forth a mask and a version of ourselves that in a way that like we want to be seen. But
Yeah.
I know from experience that it's never the full story, and there's always a bigger story behind what you're seeing at the surface level. But it can be very easy to get sucked into that and to beat yourself up about it because competitor XYZ is doing this
Right.
thing that you feel like, it could just make you feel really, really terrible about yourself. And it's
Yeah.
important to have people around you that can remind you that like it's not always as it seems.
And I think, I mean, listening to your story and even that little tidbit, right, of your econ professor telling you that you're not cut out to be an econ major and get a degree, that competitive, naturally, it's just down to competitiveness. And so I think it's so easy and natural to be very competitive within yourself for Unbound, seeing all of this like press, whereas maybe you didn't get press that week, for instance. So I think it's such a natural thing that you almost just have to be even more like recognize it even more in a sense.
Press is not, it's not what it used to be.
Totally.
I'll just say that, like, for anybody who's freaking out about like I'm not getting the press hits I want, like the world of digital media and print media and every form of media has just changed so much that like even if someone's in like a million different listicle article roundups whatever, like it doesn't move the needle as much as you might think it does in my experience. And we get like a ton of PR and a ton of press, but like it's just, again, it goes back to like the really genuine
Totally.
truth that like nothing is ever as it seems, and there are no easy answers or easy solutions, which is why entrepreneurship is such like a deeply philosophical and personal experience, because it just tests you in all the ways.
And Polly, I want to know, going back to 21 years old, getting diagnosed with cancer, and obviously like now being on the other side of that, how has that experience almost reshaped your mentality and ultimate decision to say, you know what, I'm founding a company? And the reason why I ask this as well is it's so starkly different than the mentality you went into college with, saying I need a secure path and
Mm.
I need to make money. And like, more people can tell you that founding your own company is, it's not the easiest way to do that. So walk me through that experience and that mentality.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting. I think that like when you lose a lot of anything, whether it's yourself, a relationship, money, friends. I mean, there's so many things that you can lose, or your identity can change in a way that you don't expect. And it can happen so quickly. And it's grief and it's such a loss, and you survive it and you endure through it. And I think for me it really created this genuine belief that like you really don't have much to lose. Like when you've been through something like that, you're like, okay, that was way worse. And I got through it, and it took a lot from me that like, I can feel sad about, and I can grieve, and I can certainly feel slighted, but it also like empowers you to realize like, okay, well, like if they can take all that, they being, whatever, society at large, or whatever condition you're going through. I think it just makes you realize, one, like what you're capable of, and two, that like, as our good old man FDR would say, like truly, like the only thing you have to fear is fear itself, because it's like,
Yeah.
what are you really afraid of? And when you've gone through something really traumatic, and it doesn't have to be cancer, it can be on any scale relative to like your own story and what you've personally been through. You realize just like you don't really have that much to be afraid of, because you will figure it out if you're determined and if you're doing it for the right reasons. And so in that way, like I'm really grateful for cancer and for everything I went through, because it made me realize like, one, life is really short, and I was spending all this time thinking about like, how do I get into investment banking? How do I get, a job that's going to position me for financial success? And I think it was the first step that made me realize like the money will come in whatever version of money that you need if you're doing something that you genuinely like love, and no job is perfect. Like all of them are going to drive you nuts a little bit, and it's a job, but if you can find something that you're excited about, for the most part, like you'll figure the money stuff out. And I'm saying that as somebody who like really did not have any like safety nets or anything to lean on, and it was really really hard. I was on like Medicaid and like very very poor and in debt. But you have to kind of set those boundaries for yourself, and then just like give it everything you have, and if you have those boundaries, I think you're able to give it what you can, while trying to be objective and honest with yourself, which is hard.
I love that. And I think it is hard. And it's especially hard, I think, to embrace that mentality for someone who maybe hasn't gone through something, quote unquote, traumatic in any sense or truly like life altering. So I think but it's so important to try and embody it, because at the end of the day, like we're the same in that, there are worse things, and it's not the craziest leap to take per se. And Polly, looking back at this 10-year journey with Unbound, would you do anything differently? And I'm sure there's probably a whole laundry list, but looking overall high level, what is something that you would do differently?
Whew. I mean, there's so many like little things. I think the biggest thing now, being in it for 10 years, that is so easy to say and so hard to do, is just to really enjoy it. It's so hard. And there's so many mini emergencies that come up every day where you're like, I'm sorry, like a tsunami hit our warehouse and now all of our inventory, like, there are things that just happen and you're like, what, like you can't even believe you're having to deal with the problems that you're having to deal with. But I think the more you can accept and understand, like, what are the things I can change and control, and what are the things I can't, and most importantly, like the umbrella across both of those things being like, how do I really make it a priority to enjoy what I'm doing, and to not let the stress of the things I can't control supersede my ability to connect with the people around me, to support my team, to be a human being every day who like has needs too. Because I think it's so easy to get wrapped up in like the guilt and the pressure of like, I have to work like, like 14 hours a day, or if it fails, then it'll be because I didn't try hard enough. And I think like prioritizing like, one, being a human being and saying like, hey, maybe I do need to sign off at like 6:30 so that I can like go for a run or see some friends. Yeah. And I know that sounds like so cliche and trite, but it's just like, if you're not having fun along the way, it's really not worth the sacrifice it requires. And so I think if I could do anything, I would go back and I would force myself to, which is I know it's so much easier said than done, but like, it's a good thing to find joy in between the heartache that entrepreneurship brings on a daily basis.
And you mentioned that guilt, and I think that's such a big common sentiment. And have you discovered great ways to deal with that guilt, or is it more just like talking about it right now, just reminding yourself, if you will?
I think it's I would love to say that I have it all figured out, but I don't. I think the thing that I have found, I think it depends on your personality type, but the thing that I have found to always center me is like going to like the annoying networking events that you're always like, I don't have time for this. And every time I go, especially if you're like a marginalized identity of any kind, or you feel like you don't have a community or a network in this world, like taking the time to go and connect with other people, at least for me, always reminds me that like, I'm not alone. These problems are not unique to me. And it just energizes me to realize like, and also to just be around other people that are trying to like change the world in a meaningful way. That, and then I think on the flip side of that, the introverted side of me, like, and I haven't been good about this lately, but like I've always journaled, like since I was a little girl. And I think perspective is a really hard thing to have when you're like in the moment. But having a place, one, to like actually put your thoughts. I'm also ADHD, so like forcing myself to write
Yeah.
slows my like thoughts down and my thought process, which is helpful. And then lastly, just like being able to go back and read, like whenever you feel like I will never get through this, being like, okay, but like a year ago, I also wrote that and I got through it. And so it's a helpful
Yeah.
reminder about just like
I love
perspective.
that. And it's journaling for you something every day, a weekly thing, or how often do you journal?
It really depends. I used to be so much better at it. But
It's
I try
hard.
I
It's
try to
hard to
journal
maintain.
once a week. I don't meditate. I wish I had that skill set, and I know I could develop it. But running, I was not a long distance runner. And I when I moved to New York, I like started to run because I was like, I want to see what the city looks like, because I'm from,
Yeah.
the Great Plains of Missouri. So that's my form of meditation, and I try to journal like once a week. And it's a mix. It's
Yeah.
it's not all work stuff. It's also just like, I went on this terrible date and it was awful and blah blah blah. But like,
Right.
having a place to put those experiences
Yeah.
is good, because otherwise it just lives on repeat in my brain.
I think it's also important what you said of having a mix. I think that's also important because, like, I'm also the type of person that I'm like, I'm going to journal every single day. And, like, just having that high bar and then not being able to do it, it kind of just scraps it all in a way. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like having that mix of being like, you know what, when you feel like journaling, you journal and go from there. So I love that. And I want to know, what does goal setting look like for you? Do you write down your goals? Are you a vision board type of person, or how do you? And this is also like individually for Polly, and then also Unbound.
I mean, we are a huge goals oriented company. Like, we do our annual goals, quarterly goals, monthly goals.
Okay.
So yes, as a personal oh God. I mean, I think I would love to I think I set goals for myself on like an annual basis, and I am so far from perfect. I would love to sit here and say like I'm somebody that like has a goal every year and I hit it. But I think what I try to do is be really honest with myself about like when I'm off track. Like, I'm going to be very honest and vulnerable and say like when I'm drinking too much, when I'm turning to substances of any
Yeah.
kind for like a quick fix, whether that's, like going out when I'm not really
Yeah.
like dealing with the root problem, or like not getting enough sleep because I'm like working too much or I'm too anxious. Or I think just trying to be really honest with myself about like when I'm taking shortcuts to put a band-aid over a problem, and when I really need to like sit and address something with myself that like needs more attention and care than I'm giving it, which I think it's
Yeah.
really hard, because I think in entrepreneurship, it's really easy to be like, well, but I have to do this, 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 and this, and to use it as kind of a excuse, like to use work as kind of this like
Totally.
fake shield or veil for like making poor life decisions. But
Right.
yeah, I think goals are important on like a macro level. But I think it's hard because like there's so much that's out of your control, and so I think it's also easy to beat yourself up if you don't meet them. So I think it's a mix of
It's a mix. Yeah.
aspirational and flexibility.
I love it. No, I think that's very true. And again, you even mentioning, I haven't figured this out or it's not perfect. I think that's just you being honest, right? I don't think anyone has figured it out. And if they are coming out, that's more of just like that public stance, if you will. So I ask all my guests this. So I want to ask this to you. What is your superpower?
Hmm. My super, my superpower is that I am never afraid to not know something. I am
Oh, that's a
never
great one.
I'm never afraid of, I think like throughout my professional career, I've always been taken aback by people who are like, well, I don't know how to do that. Because it's like, well, none of us know how to do anything. Like, I just think I've been put in a lot of situations in life where I am under incredibly underqualified, or underskilled, or don't have the talent to do or be what I'm doing. And I think it's being not, like truly not being afraid to step into that room and to maybe look foolish, or to be able to say like, I don't know, but I'll figure it out. And I really try to encourage a lot of like women, femme, and non-binary people in my life to not be afraid. Because I'm telling you, the men aren't afraid. They're not afraid to look stupid or to not know, or to like be really confident in the lack of qualification. And so I think that there's equal power in owning and knowing, like, I don't know what I'm doing, and like that's okay, because I'm going to give it everything I have to try to figure it out.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I heard this recently, and it relates to it, where in a meeting, men often they speak and then they think, whereas women think and then they speak. So, and it's such a simple but such a key difference that I personally very much have seen. And so I think it just relates so much to that of just like, I will say it's harder to do than say, of just like letting down those walls and just being able to just talk without having the fear of how you're judged and how people are thinking around you. So, but it's such an important one, and I appreciate that.
Wait, what's yours?
My superpower?
Yeah.
Ooh. I really love connecting to people, which is kind of why I started this podcast. So yeah, I think I have it's very natural for me to just like go on a call with a stranger and just like talk to them and get to know them in a way. So
you're curious in a genuine way.
Yeah, super
That's
curious.
really rare.
Yeah. Thank you. No, thanks. All right. My last question for you, Polly, is what craft are you spending your lifetime honing?
Oh my gosh, that is such a good question. Storytelling. And I'm not,
Ooh,
it's so hit or miss. Like I feel like on this podcast, I've definitely been winding everywhere, but
that's also on me. Don't worry.
No, I just got back from Peru and really like leaned in hard to understanding the Incan history and like this, culture that existed over 1,000 years ago. And it all of life, I think, really comes down to storytelling, and not in a manipulative way, but in an honest way of like,
totally.
How do I remember this? How do I share this? How do I tell a narrative that matters and is true and means something to someone, whether that's me or someone else? So I hope that that's the craft I hone, is storytelling.
I love that. That's amazing. All right. Polly, it's been so much fun talking to you. I could probably talk to you for hours, but I know you have a successful, incredible business that you're running. So I appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Carly.